and stifling grip they have on America. Indeed, the expanse of the regulatory state is only outmatched by the radicalism. From the energy sector to home loans, this administration has used red tape and executive authority to realize the goals of woke activists at the expense of everyday Americans. President Biden co-opted the vision of anti-energy radicals even before he entered office, when he vowed to end fossil fuel amidst thunderous applause. His administration made good on that promise to wage a war on energy. They canceled the Keystone XL pipeline. They halted court-ordered offshore lease sales, paused exports on liquefied natural gas. Everyday Americans and the energy-producing states continue to pay the price for this administration's outright hostility toward the very means by which we unlocked modern life. The president also made proponents of woke redistributive schemes happy when his administration advanced a set of mandates that punished creditworthy home buyers and forced them to subsidize riskier loans. A January 2023 Federal Housing Finance Agency directive increased fees for half of all borrowers with credit scores over 680, while decreasing fees for 90% of those under 680. Nearly 19 out of every 20 Americans have scores above the 680 threshold. That action sent a clear message which wasn't lost on middle-class Americans. If you work hard, if you pay your debts, the Biden administration wants you to subsidize the mortgages of those who did not make the same sacrifices that you did. This is the opposite of the American dream. Suffice it to say, Americans are keenly aware of the marching orders President Biden gave his administration. Embrace fringe ideas, fervently thrust them upon the populace, and leave them with the consequences. House Republicans will do everything we can to disrupt this cycle of punitive non sequiturs. That's why we're here today. The Biden administration has also exhibited a disturbing trend to surrendering to Green New Deal devotees to the detriment of everyday people. They put internal combustion engines and gas stoves, tools households across the country depend upon, in their regulatory crosshairs. Now the Biden Department of Energy is acting outside the scope of its authority to pursue a woke energy conservation agenda that harms American consumers. For example, their recent efficiency standards for residential clothes washers will increase the already high cost of such appliances, while, according to their own analysis, saving Americans about $9 over the lifetime of the appliance. H.R. 6192, the Hands Off Our Home Appliance Act, will cut to the heart of the President Biden's overzealous regulatory agenda. The bill reforms the Department of Energy's procedures for issuing energy efficiency standards by prohibiting the Secretary of Energy from prescribing any new or amended energy conservation standard for a product that is not technologically feasible nor economically justified. But the Biden administration's effort to expand executive overreach isn't just limited to the home. In 2022, the Securities and Exchange Commission issued a guidance which would make it economically impracticable for a company to hold a customer's cryptocurrency. They took an opportunity to reduce confusion and turned it into a new policy, all the while limiting the ability of two consenting parties to engage in a financial transaction. That is the very definition of executive overreach. H.J. Res. 109 provides for congressional disapproval of the SEC's attempt to disguise new policy as guidance. It also reasserts this chamber's authority in the rulemaking process. In the same spirit, we will revisit H.R. 2925, the Mining Regulatory Clarity Act. The destructive efforts of the executive branch have also been aided by allies in the judicial branch. In 2022, the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit's Rosemont decision upended 40 years of mining regulatory precedent and over a century of interpretation of the mining law of 1872. We cannot let radical environmentalists and ivory tower judges dictate whether America's natural resources will uplift American communities. H.R. 2925 will right the wrongs of the Rosemont decision. Additionally, the committee will consider H.R. 7109, the Equal Representation Act. For far too long, non-citizens have been included in the calculations that determine the apportionment of seats in the House of Representatives and the distribution of presidential electors. They are not able to vote, but as it stands now, their very presence can have an outsized effect and unfairly skew federal representation away from American citizens. What's more, President Biden's self-inflicted border crisis has added a disturbing angle to this issue because localities sympathetic to the president's agenda, particularly those so-called sanctuary jurisdictions, are poised to directly benefit. This isn't hyperbole, and it is only getting worse. Since President Biden took office, there have been over 9 million illegal crossings. That number exceeds the population of 39 states. On this administration's watch, more illegal immigrants have crossed our border than the populations of 78% of the states in the Union. The People's House must act to ensure that the principle of one person, one vote remains. H.R. 7109 does that by directing the Census Bureau to include a question on the census for responders to indicate whether they're a citizen of the United States. It also amends existing statute to ensure that citizens and only citizens are included in the population of a state for the purposes of reapportionment in the House and determining the number of electors for president. I'm certain we'll have quite a robust debate on these issues, and as always, I look forward to it and look forward to the opportunity for the House to work its will. I'll now yield to the ranking member, Mr. McGovern, for any remarks he wishes to make.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I can't wait till you guys are no longer in charge. Today, the committee will consider 4 measures, 3 for the first time and 1 for the second time after Republican leadership suffered an embarrassing procedural defeat on the House floor last week. First is H.R. 6192, the Hands Off Our Home Appliance Act. Republicans noticed a Rules Committee meeting on this bill weeks ago, but they were essentially shamed into pulling it from the agenda after they realized a bill on home appliances doesn't really meet the moment, considering all of the real crises that we have going on here in the United States and around the world. But I guess their shame only lasted a week. By the way, appliances in this country are getting more energy efficient. And I can't believe I need to say this, but that's a good thing. That's a good thing. It lowers utility bills, and it puts money back into the pockets of everyday people. And it's not happening by accident. It's happening because of strong rules and regulations adopted by Congress and our federal agencies to protect consumers and enhance efficiency. Why Republicans want to undo all of that is beyond me. I can only assume it's another favor for their corporate sponsors that call the shots. To claim that any of this is about consumer choice is just nuts. The only choice they're giving people here is to pay more on their utility bills. Second is H.R. 7109, the Equal Representation Act, a Republican attempt to rig the census and ignore the Constitution's requirement that we count everyone, not just some people, but all people. Next is H.J. Res. 109, a Congressional Review Act, which would potentially prevent the SEC from issuing staff guidance on cryptocurrency. No idea which Republican donor or lobbyist asked for that, but here it is. And finally is H.R. 2925, the Mining Regulatory Clarity Act of 2024. Again, last week, the House agreed in a bipartisan vote on the floor to send this bill back to the Natural Resources Committee with instructions to report it back with an amendment offered by Ms. Ledger-Fernandez. That amendment, the Ledger-Fernandez amendment, would have modified this bill to ban companies from foreign adversary nations from conducting mining activities on America's public lands. It would stop them from exploiting American resources and polluting our public lands, and then profiting off those resources and forcing the American taxpayer to do the cleanup. As you know, Mr. Chairman, her motion passed. So I'm a little puzzled why this bill is back before the Rules Committee and not the Natural Resources Committee. And since I won't have the opportunity to question the chairman of the Natural Resources Committee, I'm going to use this opportunity to ask for some clarification. And I'm happy to yield to you, Mr. Chairman, to explain if you think it's a good idea for Republican leaders to just ignore the House's vote and send this bill not to the Natural Resources Committee, but right back to the Rules Committee.
Gentlemen, we yield. I think the Natural Resources has acted on this bill. Their preference was known to us last week when we had the original hearing on this, and I think it's appropriate to bring it back to the floor, and I'll yield back.
Yeah, and I guess what that answer ignores is the fact that the House had a vote. Clearly a bipartisan majority in the House thought Ms. Ledger-Fernandez had a good idea. And she moved on the House floor to recommit the bill back to the Natural Resources Committee, not the Rules Committee. And instead of doing what the House directed, Republican leaders said this is coming right back to the Rules Committee and totally bypassing the committee it was supposed to go to. I mean, what's the point here? Is it to avoid debating the Ledger-Fernandez amendment or what? I'm just trying to understand, like, the House voted in a bipartisan way to do a certain thing, and we're not doing that here. Is there a reason for that?
Well, the gentleman yield.
Yeah, happy to yield.
The House will have its opportunity to vote again this week, and I look for a positive outcome.
Look, this is an important issue that deserves debate. And if Republicans want to make the case that Chinese corporations should be allowed to plunder our public lands and resources for free, they should send it back to the Natural Resources Committee to make that case. But I guess that's not going to happen here. We're just going to pretend like the vote on the House floor didn't happen. I guess that's how regular order works under this majority. Votes only matter if they like the outcome. And to add insult to injury, last year we heard on and on from the other side that Joe Biden was, quote, betraying America by letting China purchase American oil. Now Republicans want to let Chinese companies come in and extract minerals from our public lands and then force Americans to clean up the mess that they leave behind. Now, I'd love to hear how my friends on the other side contort themselves to explain this obvious contradiction, but I don't think that we have the time. So this is all just more of the same from this failed Republican majority. It's all about partisan warfare. Instead of actually working with Democrats to get stuff done. And what really is concerning, it really is about ignoring the rules and the procedures and the processes of this House, ignoring the will of a bipartisan majority of Congress in this case. I mean, the Rules Committee, as I said last week, should be renamed the Break the Rules Committee, because that's what we seem to be doing every week that we meet. And I think it's regrettable. I think it's regrettable not just because I don't think it's fair, and not just because it doesn't respect the will of the majority in this House. I think it's regrettable because I think it further demeans this institution. And with that, I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman for his remarks, and gentleman yields back. Without objection, any prepared statements that our witnesses have will be included into the record. And I do want to welcome our first panel, Subcommittee Chairman Jeff Duncan and Ranking Member Frank Ballone from the Committee on Energy and Commerce. Subcommittee Chairman Duncan, I welcome your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Burgess, and congratulations on taking the gavel. It's a well-deserved honor. And I want to thank you and Ranking Member McGovern for recognizing me to speak in support of Congresswoman Lesko's bill, H.R. 6192, the Hands Off Our Home Appliances Act, which will help stop the Biden administration's war on Americans' home appliances. This bill is considered today will reform the Department of Energy's appliance and equipment standards, setting process and protect several commonly used home appliances, including dishwashers, air conditioners, refrigerators, clothes dryers, and washing machines. H.R. 6192 has gone through regular order. That means it's gone through the committee process. Through hearings and markups in the Energy and Commerce Committee, it's become clear that Congress must act to prevent the Biden administration from banning natural gas appliances and eliminating product features that the American people rely on. Through sue and settlement agreements with the environmental groups, the DOE has aggressive plans to regulate the sale of more than 60 categories of appliances and equipment. The DOE may ban and restrict access to thousands of household products that Americans can purchase today to heat our homes, prepare our meals, and wash our clothes. The DOE's Appliance Standards program is big government on steroids. The Biden administration and Democrats want to tell you what type of car to drive, how much water you can use in your shower, and how to cook your food. My constituents, like many Americans, were shocked to learn that the Department of Energy could abuse its authority to ban gas stoves. Thankfully, Congress came together, and we passed legislation to overturn the gas stove ban with a strong bipartisan vote last year. There's plenty of precedent for Congress to step in. In recent years, Congress has passed laws to clarify DOE's authorities to regulate light bulbs, ceiling fans, refrigerators, air conditioners, heat pumps, water heaters, furnaces, dishwashers, and the list goes on and on and on. The fact that Congress has to step in so many times over the years demonstrates that the efficiency standard setting process is fundamentally broken, and it's no longer serving the interests of the American people. H.R. 6192, the Hands Off Our Appliances Act, will fix this fundamentally broken standard setting process. The legislation will clarify DOE's authority to regulate, and it will prohibit standards that are not cost-effective or technologically feasible. This bill will ensure that DOE conducts a true cost-benefit analysis and considers the harmful impact that cost increases will have on the low-income households, on renters, and those struggling to afford a new home and the appliances that come in it. H.R. 6192 will also ensure that if an appliance with an efficiency upgrade costs more money up front, then American consumer will actually save a significant amount of energy, enough to pay back the cost of that increase within 3 years. Finally, H.R. 6192 will prohibit the DOE from banning natural gas appliances and taking away product and performance features that we rely upon as Americans. These reforms are necessary to protect the affordability and reliability of home appliances and prevent the DOE from abusing its statutory authority. It's imperative that Congress act now to reform the DOE Appliance Standard Program. The Department of Energy just issued a series of proposed and finalized rules that exceed the DOE's statutory authority. In recent months, the DOE has announced plans to impose burdensome new regulations that will raise the price and reduce the performance of dishwashers, air conditioners, refrigerators, clothes dryers, and washing machines. The DOE has failed to demonstrate the need for these new regulations, and it's failed to show that they are cost-effective and technologically feasible. Now, I think it's imperative to get in the record what the Secretary of Energy said just last week. Secretary Granholm said in our budget hearing last week, quote, "We are obsessed with reducing the amount of energy Americans use." But I would ask, at what cost? Congress must act to stop the Biden administration and the DOE from waging war on our home appliances. With the cost of everything increasing as a result of runaway inflation caused by the Biden administration's reckless spending policies, the last thing the DOE should be doing is making home appliances that Americans rely on every day even more expensive. The proposed ban on gas stoves was a wake-up call. The Biden administration should put affordability and reliability above the interest of the radical climate lobby. These bills in front of us today do just that, and I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to join me in sending another strong message to the Biden administration to keep their hands off our home appliances. It's common sense, and I look forward to answering your questions. I yield back.
Thank you.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Burgess. I'd like to include my statement for the record, but I'm going to try to
That
summarize.
objection's ordered.
Thank you. Well, first of all, let me congratulate you on becoming the chair of the Rules Committee and wish you the best in that capacity. But I have to disagree with what both you and Chairman Duncan said about this legislation, and I wrote down some of the things that were said. Legislation was considered a response to radicalism by the Department of Energy or by the Democrats. I don't think there's anything radical about trying to have more efficient appliances and saving money for consumers. A statement was made about how the efficiency standards exceed executive authority. It's simply not the case. I mean, the fact of the matter is, for years, the Department of Energy has been obliged under the statute to look at efficiency and establish more efficiency standards with the cooperation of the manufacturers and industry. That's what they do. We can't, as congressmen, legislate every detail of energy efficiency. We have to leave it up to the agencies to do that, and that's exactly what they do in this case and in every case when they've had to look at energy efficiency standards in the past. A statement was made about how middle-class Americans, are going to suffer. I think middle-class Americans want energy efficiency and lower-cost appliances. And the fact of the matter is, look, this bill, and I know some of you quoted this, you said that in the summary of the bill, it says that it will ban or any new appliance standards that are not technologically feasible and economically justifiable. Well, that's exactly what the existing law does. It requires the Department of Energy to look at what's technologically feasible and what's economically justifiable. And so it's very much, the bill is really kind of duplicative, in my opinion, of what the Energy Department already does. In terms of cost savings, just to give you some example, let's set the record straight. Energy conservation standards save consumers money. The Biden administration energy efficiency actions are estimated to provide $1 trillion in consumer savings over 30 years. Recently finalized standards for water heaters will save American households about $7.6 billion per year on their energy and water bills. Recently finalized refrigerator standards will save Americans $36.4 billion over 30 years of sales. And then there's an $18 billion savings through the clothes washer standard and a $21 billion savings from clothes dryers. These are real numbers. These are the numbers that when the department is trying to decide what to do, they look at and come to that conclusion. It's real money that saves Americans in their wallets. And there's again, as Chairman Duncan said, that he wants to include with this bill a cost-benefit analysis. That's exactly what the department does now. They do a cost-benefit analysis of what's going to be saved, of upfront, long-term performance features are an important part of this. Everything that I hear my colleagues saying, both Chairman Burgess and Chairman Duncan, are exactly what's done. To suggest that somehow this isn't saving money or not making the appliances more efficient or making them less perform worse, none of these things are accurate. And I mean, I guess you could say whatever you want, but the bottom line is that this is what the department is required to do. And for us to substitute as members of Congress and say that's not what they're doing, when they set forth all this in written form and explain all this in their analysis, I just think is wrong. I don't understand how you can make those conclusions based on the facts that are presented by the Department of Energy. I don't think this is the last time we're going to have this debate. As you know, Chairman Burgess, since you're on the Energy and Commerce Committee, we had, I think, 6 bills. One was this one from Congresswoman Lesko that is more general, and then there were 5 for each of the appliances. So I suspect we're going to get, every week or at some point we're going to get, this come back on refrigerators and then dishwashers and then, I just think that we have better things to do here than talk about, the so-called radicalism of appliance efficiency standards. I don't think there's anything radical at all. I think that what this administration is doing by the book is trying to save money, trying to create more efficiency, better performance, and at the same time try to address the climate crisis by not having more impact on our climate that creates more greenhouse gases and more extreme weather conditions that certainly are not in the interest of the American people or of anyone. So again, I would just ask that this legislation be rejected. To me, it just makes no sense, and I yield back.
Chair, thanks, gentleman. Gentleman yields back. I thank both of you for your participation here today. I guess my only question is, it's almost like you included, Chairman Duncan, a cost-benefit analysis. This thing has to be worth, whatever efficiency measure there is, it has to actually be worth it to the consumer. I mean, that seems like a good common sense restriction to put in legislation like this. Why wouldn't that be okay, Mr. Plone?
But my point I'm trying to make is that's already the case, right? And I'm not trying to be difficult, but you act like there's some kind of radical Green Deal initiative here. These efficiency standards and the way they go about deciding them have been around for years. This isn't the first time this has been done. This is nothing new.
Reclaim my time, but the problem is, if they don't deliver on the promise, then the poor consumer is the one who's stuck with it. I have no other questions. I'm going to yield to the gentlelady from Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I do want to say that I hear from my constituents about gas stoves. They ask me if we are really going to ban their gas stoves, whether it be a restaurant or a lot of the restaurants ask me about it, and private individuals. So it is an issue because I hear about it in my district. But Mr. Duncan, some folks contend that new standards must meet the requirements we impose in this bill already, and they argue that it's all about efficiency. But we still see the standards that would effectively ban gas stoves and other appliances, all at the cost to the taxpayer. And I'm just wondering if you could explain why is that? Why are they still pursuing?
Well, President Biden has said it, and Secretary Granholm has confirmed it many times. There's a war on fossil fuels. The administration does not want fossil fuels, so they want to ban all appliances that use fossil fuels, including gas stoves. We've already seen so many other appliances brought up. We've been right here in front of Rules Committee talking about previous bans. Chairman Burgess mentioned cost-benefit analysis. Well, I can do it for you. The appliances will cost more. Electricity prices are higher because of the Biden war on energy. So the appliance costs more, and the payback period is extended further in the future from any savings that might come about because the energy prices that consumers are paying now are much higher. So you're extending the payback period, you're paying more for energy because of the Biden administration policies, and now you have to pay more for the appliance, which is driving the cost of the homes up. It's driving the cost of replacement appliances if you're a homeowner, or if you're a renter and you have to have your own appliances and you bring them in, you have to buy them, it's costing the consumer more. And I hear, like you do, from my consumers, my constituents, restaurants, individuals, homeowners, especially the younger first-time home buyers that are trying to buy the first appliances, and it's just costing them an extraordinary amount of money, and they see what the Biden administration is doing with energy prices and with appliance prices.
Well, and Mr. Duncan, I appreciate that, because I was going to ask you a little bit about the economic impact it's having, but I think you expressed that well. And so I guess I will yield back to myself, and I will, call on Mr. McGovern.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And let me just say, I mean, we're hearing some discussion about Secretary Granholm is obsessed with this and obsessed with that. I think what they're obsessed with is finding ways to save the consumers money and saving them undue costs. That's what this is all about. These efficiency standards that have already been put into place, Mr. Plone pointed out, are going to save consumers billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars in the next several years. So I mean, I would rather do that, save consumers money, than merely pad the pockets of the fossil fuel industry. But anyway, thank you, Mr. Pallone, and thank you, Mr. Duncan, for being here. And for the sake of moving things along, I'm not going to repeat what I said in my opening statement, but it just seems like Republicans think energy efficiency is a bad thing, which is at odds with what the vast majority of Americans think. But putting that aside, Mr. Duncan, are you aware that this bill was noticed to come before the Rules Committee 2 weeks ago? Are you aware that this bill that we're now talking about was noticed to come before the Rules Committee 2 weeks ago?
I'm not, that's above my pay grade, sir.
Well, it was. And are you also aware that the committee planned to bring up 4 other appliance-related bills at the time, in addition to the one that we're currently considering?
I'm fine with that and wish they would bring them all up.
Okay.
Because there is a war on the American
Well,
consumer.
I guess my question to you is why the change? I mean, you're here on behalf of the House leadership to talk about this appliance, why this appliance bill should come to the floor. Can you explain to us why the four other appliance bills are not being considered again, but this one is?
Again, that's a question for leadership. That's above my pay grade. I'm a lowly subcommittee chairman on energy, but I will say this bill came through regular order through subcommittee and full committee after hearings of markup.
Are you aware what the titles of the other bills were that were supposed to come before this committee?
Again, I'm
Well,
not,
let me read you the titles. One of them was the Liberty in Laundry Act. Another was the Refrigerator Freedom Act. And here's why I think we're not considering those bills, because I think they're an embarrassment to this institution. I mean, it seems to me Republican leadership probably realized the irony of bringing up a bill about freedom for refrigerators while simultaneously taking freedom away from millions of women in this country by overturning Roe versus Wade. And maybe they realized it was a bad look to talk about liberty in laundry while simultaneously trying to take away liberty for people who want to use IVF. And I would just say that when we use words like freedom and liberty, this is the United States Congress. These are words that are written into our founding documents, ideas Americans have fought and died for. In Ukraine right now, soldiers and civilians are being killed because they are standing up for these very principles. And when your side throws those words around and talks about refrigerator freedom, it cheapens them. And it degrades those words and it degrades this institution. So I'm glad that Republicans realized how silly and frivolous these bills are and that they pulled them from today's hearing. I'm not sure that they are banned, they will be pulled forever, but I'm going to take that as a semi-positive sign because, I mean, it was laughable, given all that is happening in this country and all that is happening in this world, that the bills that contain the words freedom and liberty are about household appliances. I mean, we have to start getting serious around here about what is important and what is not. And again, bills that are aimed at trying to save consumers money, trying to promote energy efficiency, yes, trying to wean us off of fossil fuels. I mean, I think we can have a debate on that, but to use words like freedom and liberty with regard to refrigerators and wash machines, I just think is an embarrassment. And I don't have any questions. Yeah, I'll yield to Mr. Pallone.
Well, let me just say, I totally agree with you. In fact, when I saw those labels for the bills in the committee, I was wondering if maybe, somebody had substituted them for the real thing. I was kind of surprised that the Republicans themselves used those labels for the bills, to be perfectly honest. But I just wanted to say quickly two things you raised. One is the whole issue of affordability. And, I really believe that in our committee, we have highlighted affordability, not only for, to make, save costs on appliances, but also on things like the Affordable Connectivity Fund to help people pay for their internet, to subsidize and help people pay for their health care. I mean, the list goes on, and that's been a hallmark, I think, of the Democrats' initiative in our committee. So I appreciate you bringing up the whole issue of affordability, because that's what we're all about as Democrats. And then the last thing I wanted to say is, one of the things that was quite clear when the Secretary of Energy came before us last week, I believe, was that this administration believes in an all of the above energy policy, right? Mr. Duncan, Chairman Duncan and Chairman Burgess talked about the war on fossil fuels. More oil, more natural gas is being produced now with this administration than any time before. We just came through this committee to a nuclear package to try to expand the use of nuclear power. Now, not everybody agrees with that. The fact of the matter is we're increasing everything, right? But we also prioritize trying to move towards renewables because we think that we need to move towards renewables because the day of fossil fuels is, at some point, there aren't going to be any fossil fuels around anymore, and they continue to contribute to climate change and increased greenhouse gases. So we want to prioritize renewables. But by no means did the Secretary suggest anything other than an all-of-above policy. So this idea of a war on energy is just nonsense, frankly. So I yield back. With
No, and
the
I thank
time.
you. And again, as I said in my opening statement, energy efficiency is not a bad thing. Saving consumers money is not a bad thing. Only, in a Congress that is run by Republicans, are those things considered undesirable. And again, I would just end by, again, repeating that whoever is coming up with your agenda, freedom for refrigerators and liberty and laundry, ought to be reminded that this is the United States Congress. This is not Saturday Night Live. This is supposed to be a serious place, and it's about time we acted like it. With that, I yield back.
I would call on Mr. Norman.
I'm going to agree with Mr. McGovern, and we seldom agree, Mr. McGovern, but the fact this is silly and the fact that the seriousness, why don't we get serious? This is a silly attempt by the Biden administration to make the American consumer buy something. Jeff said it just right, at what cost? And I sat through a previous, we shouldn't even be having to deal with letting government bureaucrats tell consumers what they want. And the fact that, you mentioned getting serious, what about and you mentioned the deaths in Ukraine, what about the seriousness at the border? What about the deaths of the Americans through fentanyl? What about the crime that's running that this administration is promoting? What about that? And you talk about the Constitution, I think it's we the people decide, not bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. And Jeff, you hit it just right. At what cost? You can make, I was talking to a liberal not long ago, and they wanted to make a car so no one gets killed in it. You can do that at what cost? These electric vehicles are a joke. Roger Williams is burying it. He's literally burying a car because no one wants it. You can try to force government down the throats of the American people. That's why they're sick and tired of this administration doing this. It's an assault on our very freedoms. It is about freedom. And it's being taken from us. And God only help us if we have to stand another 4 years of this insanity. That's what it is. To think, I would have never in my wildest dreams would think the government was, and you, Mr. Maloney, you quote trillions of dollars. You let the American people decide, pick what they want. That's freedom. And, the bureaucrats that are saying this is so wise, that's not their expertise. The people want government out of their lives, out of the way, and get back to the basics, which is why his approval, this Biden administration approval numbers have not hit rock bottom yet. They're sick of it. So to even have to deal with this, the Biden administration is making us deal with it, and thank God we're fighting it. I yield to Jeff.
I think Mr. Norman's exactly right. Mr. McGovern, when Republicans talk about freedom and liberty, we talk about it in the spirit of our founding fathers. And that's true liberty and freedom. Freedom to choose, freedom to innovate, freedom to be entrepreneurs, freedom from big government. And what we see now in the United States of America is a far cry from what our founding fathers envisioned. They envisioned a small central federal government handling 17 enumerated powers defined in the Constitution of the United States. We're way beyond 17 enumerated powers in the United States government now. A government which is telling American consumers and manufacturers what they can buy and what they can manufacture. Because Big Brother thinks best. Big Brother knows best. We're from the government and we're here to help. That's not what the founding fathers envisioned. They envisioned a very limited federal government. And we have a free market capitalist society. Regardless of what the socialists around this country and around this town want to believe, we still have a free market capitalist society. And innovators and entrepreneurs are building the products that American consumers want, but yet we see a continued push by big government down on the American people, telling them what kind of cars they have to drive, telling them what kind of appliances they can buy, the only appliances they can buy, telling them they can't catch rainwater off their own roof for use in their homes. That's what too much government gets you. We get situations like this where big government has said, you can't have a gas stove. Even though gas is very efficient for cooking, ask every restaurateur out there, they would rather have a gas stove cooking the meals that we eat at those restaurants. Consumers would rather have a gas stove in their home to cook on and would rather have something that they can rely on in the dead of winter when the electricity has gone out because snow has taken down a power line. They still have a gas appliance in there to help heat their home, whether it's a gas HVA system or whether it's a gas logs in the fireplace that they can rely on. And natural gas is affordable, and we're blessed in this country with an abundance of it, but yet we see big government continued to tamp down the fossil fuel industry because of some sort of political agenda embracing climate change. And it's time to get the big government off the throat of the American people and the American manufacturing. That's too much government, and I'll tell you again, when we talk about freedom and liberty, we talk about it in the spirit of our founding fathers, and that's a limited central government, not what we're seeing today. And I thank the gentleman for yielding.
And-
Will the gentleman yield?
Sure.
Yeah, I'm trying to recall my history where Thomas Jefferson or any of the founders talked about freedom for refrigerators or liberty in laundry.
No, they talked
And
about
if you
freedom
wanna-
and liberty.
The gentleman talked earlier about the low approval rating of the current president. You know what the approval rating of Congress is? It's something like 15%.
It should be lower than that.
Right, well, you guys are in charge. It should be lower than that. I agree with you. But I just point that out because I'm not sure how low anybody can go. We're leading, you guys are leading that way. So anyway, thank you, the gentleman, for yielding, and I'll yield back.
Well, all I'll say is freedom is quickly being eroded by this administration. If I have to get asked one more time, gas appliances came up. Why are gas prices where they are now? Why are we having to fight for everything? There's been no savings on anything. Everything under this administration is up. And Americans, the only good news is they're sick and tired of it. And to cap it all off, at the end of this month, the World Health Organization, this administration will lock us down. If he gets by with it, we'll lose our sovereignty over give it to countries that are controlled by China. It's a joke. And if it'd be so serious, it would be a joke if it wasn't so serious. So we'll fight. And the good news is there's a number of us here that are going to fight this. And there's a growing number of Americans who are sick and tired of government. Thank you for both of you for being here, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Norman. Ms. Scanlon?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Like the ranking member, I sort of had hoped that the House Republicans had abandoned the attempt to stir up a war on household appliances. But here we are, considering the Hands Off Our Home Appliances Act. For nearly 50 years, the Department of Energy has saved Americans hundreds of billions of dollars by setting prudent, energy-efficient appliance standards. Consumers like these standards. I look for these standards when I buy appliances for my house. Nobody's ever forced me to give up an appliance. They die of their own accord eventually. But knowing what I can expect from a new appliance because the government has established some standards is pretty important. And anyone concerned about the environment appreciates the fact that there's some standards by which we can judge the products that we are looking for. That helps our freedom to decide what we want to purchase and what we want to bring into our homes. But we're seeing that every time the Department of Energy sets a new standard, we get hysterics from House Republicans. The bill's sponsor says that the Biden administration is waging a war on everyday household appliances, which is ridiculous. We're talking about energy efficiency standards for new products coming out 5 or 10 years in the future, and the current proposed standards, once implemented, are projected to save households over $570 billion in reduced energy costs. And yet, Republicans are trying to persuade Americans that Big Brother's coming for your toaster. This is crazy. This is a waste of time for for the government, it's a waste of time for Congress, it's a waste of taxpayer dollars. And as several people on both sides of the aisle have pointed out, we have much more important things that we should be attending to. So what's clear is that it is an election year, and people like to make speeches and say that they are protecting freedoms when it has nothing to do with that. There's no record for Republicans to run upon, as some of our colleagues on that side of the aisle have said. So what we're seeing is theatrics about liberty for laundry and freedom for refrigerators and gas stove wars, and it's all a lot of nonsense. And I really wish that we could get back to some regular order and actually doing the people's business here. Mr. Pallone, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I just want to say, kind of reiterate what you say, as the ranking member on the Energy and Commerce Committee, we deal with so many consumer issues, healthcare issues, energy issues, and I get very frustrated because I think that the American consumer expects the government, contrary to what Chairman Duncan said, to set standards, right? So, I get people come up to me and say, well, you're selling vitamins and I guess they're safe. And I'll say, well, to some extent, you have food safety. I assume that when I go to the grocery store that that's safe to eat. Well, yes and no, because if you start basically getting rid of standards, right? We're not going to review food safety. We're not going to review appliances. We're not going to review various consumer goods. Then people aren't going to feel safe, and that they can actually go and buy these things and they're safe and healthy. And it's exactly what you said. They think that the standards are being set and this refrigerator is more efficient or this refrigerator or dishwasher is safe to use. And if we follow the philosophy that I hear from Chairman Duncan and some of the Republican members, they're like laissez-faire, sell whatever you want. Sell a medicine that's fake, sell food that's got botulism, sell a refrigerator that doesn't work, and that's okay. This is the market system. I don't know anybody who believes that. I mean, maybe there are some, but I think that the government, that people and consumers expect us to actually regulate things so that they're safe, they're efficient, they save money, and it's almost like they want to step in and say we either shouldn't have that or somehow Congress should decide on the regulation or every detail, which is not possible. So I just appreciate what you're saying. I don't think people want to operate in the world that the Republicans have just envisioned. That's not what people think as consumers. But I yield back.
Well, when we received this raft of bills, most of which have now been withdrawn, perhaps because their names were so ridiculous, I was really struck by the fact that, first of all, it was the same bill, just kind of cut and pasted multiple times. And it emphasized that there should not be an increased cost to consumers to purchase or replace or recycle or do whatever with these appliances. But what was striking was it left out of the calculation the savings that a consumer could get from having this energy-efficient appliance. So it very firmly put its thumb on the scale for taking energy efficiency out of the equation, which, I mean, obviously, as we've all said, has been part of the equation, is certainly part of the equation for many consumers when they consider whether they're buying a new car or a new appliance or whatever, is how efficient it is. How much is it going to cost to run from day to day? And I think that's an important thing that the government can help people understand and decide. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Langworthy?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative Duncan, there's been no shortage of mockery by our colleagues on the other side of the aisle about the names of bills, but I mean, it's very rich and ironic coming from, people that champion something called the Inflation Reduction Act that did nothing but hypercharge the economy and send inflation through the roof. But we wouldn't be discussing these if we didn't have to go toe-to-toe with the Biden administration's regulatory onslaught against various appliances, from gas stoves to refrigerators to dishwashers. And these are certainly things that we're hearing from our constituents. Consumer groups have estimated that under the Biden administration's regulatory regime, that American households will be forced to shoulder thousands of dollars in upgrades as the cost of appliances goes up to meet these ever more strident standards. And I don't think that the American people would agree that these are appliances that are lasting longer. They're actually lasting shorter windows of time in households. Do you think that hitting American families with thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars in extra costs for basic needs like for their cooking and cleaning and air conditioning and furnaces, should that be taken lightly, as our colleagues on the other side of the aisle seem to be? Because that's not what I'm hearing from my constituents. Anything you'd like to add there?
Americans are already paying, as Mr. Norman said, a lot of money under this administration because of inflation. The inflation that we see is direct result of the Biden administration's policies that started on day one as a war on energy. Energy costs factor into everything that's manufactured in this country. From the manufacturing cost, supply chain issues, electricity cost to run the manufacturing plant, transportation cost that are passed on to the consumer, from the transportation companies to the retailer and then to the consumer. And they're tired of it. This is another example where these regulations will limit choices and drive up cost. There's no argument that these new appliances under these standards proposed by the administration will cost more money. And that extends the payback for paying for those appliances much longer. So, this is an example of the Biden administration putting climate and efficiency agenda over everything else. And that agenda has affected everything in Americans' lives. They want Americans to use less energy, but they don't care about the cost.
Thank you. I couldn't agree with you more. I represent constituents. Many live in rural communities in the far western part of New York State. In a state where Democrat-run government has made the decision to one-up the Biden administration and is pushing for even more radical policies to decarbonize and to raise efficiency standards, service operators, utilities. Everyone in our state has indicated that this will cost New Yorkers upwards of $20,000 to even $30,000 to upgrade homes. This is the energy future that the Biden administration, through regulatory action at the Department of Energy, the EPA, and others, is working to foist on the backs of all of the American people. So with that in mind, Representative Duncan, our colleagues on the other side of the dais here today have warned that H.R. 6192 will hobble the Department of Energy's ability to issue emissions-reducing conservation standards. Do you think that slowing down the regulatory machinery within our federal agencies is something that the American people are deeply concerned about?
Absolutely, they're concerned about it. And they should be concerned about the Biden administration's whole-of-government approach to pursuing climate policy over everything else. The energy conservation standards we're talking about here today, they put the climate change considerations over the interest of the American consumer. As I said in my rant earlier, it's too much government. Americans are getting fed up with so much government, and they want, as Mr. McGovern said, they want freedom and liberty. They want the freedom to choose. They want their liberty to innovate, create products that the American consumer wants. As Mr. Norman said, Congressman Williams from Texas is an auto dealer. He's choking on the EVs that he can't sell, that's forced down from the dealers, from the manufacturers to the dealerships, and there's no market for it because the consumer doesn't want it. The consumer wants something else. And I hear that all over South Carolina from the dealers we know. And so the government wants to tell you what kind of car to drive, what kind of appliance to use, that you can't catch rainwater off your house to utilize in your garden or any other uses on your homestead. They want to tell you how to cook food. They want to end your use of gas appliances. Why? It's because they don't like fossil fuels. Joe Biden has said it. He was going to end fracking. It was a war on energy from day one. And this is just another cog in that big wheel of big government from the Biden administration pushing a certain climate agenda, and the American people are paying for it.
Thank you, Representative Duncan. I appreciate you reiterating these points today and sharing why this legislation is important. I've spoken to folks in my state who work in HVAC, plumbing and electrical, and they've recounted to me how difficult it is to explain to someone, especially seniors on fixed incomes, who, they're retired, they're pinching pennies, but because radical decisions made by unelected bureaucrats, here in Washington or in our state capital in Albany, that the cost of replacing their furnace or other basic appliances just went up by thousands of dollars, and they don't have the same solutions they would have had a year or two ago. For the sake of ensuring an affordable and reliable future for the American people, we need to do everything we can to put the brakes on this administration's Green New Deal agenda. And with that, I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Langworthy. Mr. Neguse?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Chairman Duncan and Ranking Member Pallone, for your testimony and for being here today. Mr. Duncan, I don't want to belabor the point here, but I listened with great interest to your primer on the constitutional order of our country and the principles of limited government as you see it, and your perceptions about supposed overreach by the federal government in this case that apparently was the impetus for the Hands Off Our Home Appliances Act. I think House Republicans at least were wise enough to keep the rest of their bills, the Refrigerator Freedom Act and the like, from the floor this week. But nonetheless, I listened to that primer with great interest. Some of the words you used, just in response to my colleague from New York's questions, were too much government, freedom to choose, which of course is, ironic given the position of House Republicans in undermining the right, the freedom to make one's own health reproductive decisions. But I guess what I really would like for you to help expound to me is where you draw the line when it comes to what you describe as too much government. You said there's too much government in selecting one's toaster, I guess, or one's refrigerator, apparently, or one's washer and dryer. You went through this litany of examples. Where do you draw the line?
Where do I draw the line on what?
Yeah, how do you see, you take issue with the federal government's role, in this case, with respect to the bill that you all have proposed. Where do you draw the line as to how much government is too much government?
Well, there's 17 enumerated powers in the United States Constitution, and I think government has well exceeded that. I think a return to a smaller, limited federal government
Sure.
is better.
Okay.
That's how our founders envisioned this.
That's helpful. That's what I was hoping you would say. You believe there's too much government in appliances, or the selection thereof. Do you think there's too much government in baseball?
I don't think government has a role in baseball.
You don't think government has a role in baseball? That's fascinating. Are you familiar with the Competition in Professional Baseball Act?
Well, there's some antitrust laws.
No, I didn't ask you that. I asked if you're familiar with that bill. I mean, I hope you'd be familiar with it because it's your bill.
I am, yeah.
Right? Yeah. You authored the Competition in Professional Baseball Act. That bill does what? It amends the Clayton Act to ultimately eliminate one of the antitrust exemptions that exists for professional baseball. You're familiar with the Clayton Act, yes?
I am.
And the Clayton Act is designed to do what? Protect consumers, is that right? Is the Clayton Act part of the 17 enumerated powers of the federal government under the Constitution as you see it? That you hold so true and fast to?
Probably.
Probably? Okay, so looks like we found an exception. Maybe we can go down the list of some others. You see my point, Mr. Duncan.
I said it was too much government.
Oh, yeah, I understand, but apparently too much government in the case of the bill that you proposed, but not too much government in the case of professional baseball, where apparently you've introduced a bill, or at least you introduced a bill.
Trying to roll back
Hold on,
some of
Mr.
government,
Duncan, I'll finish
just
my
like this
statement,
is
and
trying.
I'll give you an opportunity to respond, in which you introduced a bill in the last Congress to give the FTC more powers so that it could regulate professional baseball. So you could imagine, I think, my surprise, and I suspect for those who are watching, their surprise to hear you defend liberty for refrigerators, but then demand that the federal government intervene in the regulation of professional baseball. I find that a bit disconnected from the philosophy that you've articulated. But I'm happy to...
Well, there's already antitrust laws out there that baseball has to operate under. And trying to roll back some of that is lessening government's involvement.
Yeah, again, that's not the nature of your bill. The bill provides for an amendment of the...
The laws already exist.
Let me finish my statement here. The Clayton Act, which as you know is over 100 years old, does not include baseball, and the courts, going back a generation, have ruled that professional baseball is not subject to the antitrust laws of the United States of America. You, sir, have introduced a bill to mandate that professional baseball be subject to the antitrust laws of the United States and to give the Federal Trade Commission the powers to regulate it thereof. You shouldn't be embarrassed by it. That's your position.
So,
my
because there
point-
were antitrust violations. And so the antitrust laws, I didn't write.
I hear you.
The antitrust laws were on the books.
And apparently you believe
And
that
baseball was
it's in
given
the
an exemption.
interest of the American public for the federal government to have a role to protecting consumers, which you've spent the better part of the last half hour
Well,
attacking that very view.
Antitrust laws fall
So-
under commerce, which the federal government enumerated powers to
Sure,
regulate.
sure. Well, you have a broader view of the Commerce Clause than, certainly than apparently the framers that you were describing previously. But to the extent that you care to jump in, Ranking Member Pallone, about the regulation of professional baseball, you're welcome to, but.
Talk about baseball, but I just think, look, this kind of goes back to what Congresswoman Scanlon said, right? The public assumes that the government has a role in protecting consumers, right? Whether it's baseball, it's food safety, it's appliances, whatever. And so I think that to suggest that there's some kind of ideological view that says that the government shouldn't play that role is not the case. That's what the public assumes. And they'd be shocked to hear, I think, some of the statements here today suggesting that, you know, we just have this market economy where anything goes and the federal government shouldn't step in and regulate things. That's not what I hear from my constituents. They want us to regulate problems if there's, I don't know what there is, but let's assume there's some kind of shady dealings in baseball. They want to make sure that when they go to the game, there's fair play. Same thing with food safety, same thing with appliances. They rely on us to help them as consumers, and to suggest that that somehow is not what the framers intended, I don't agree.
Couldn't say better than the ranking member, and couldn't agree with you more. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Sure, thanks, the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Georgia is now recognized for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just point out that I think those who talk about the cost savings, they're not factoring in the increased cost of the appliance. And I can tell you, as somebody who's been shopping for an ice maker over the last several weeks, it costs today about twice what it did just 5 years ago to buy one. And one of the issues for the American consumer today is a lot of the newer appliances can't be serviced the way the old appliances could be. And so I can tell you, I don't get rid of my old appliances. I've got a freezer that's 15 years old, and I'll repair it until it rusts all the way out, because you can't repair a lot of the new appliances at a reasonable cost. So I'm not going to belabor this point. I'm going to mention this to you, Mr. Pallone, because I want you to know why many of us who are conservationists, don't trust what comes out of the far left in Washington, D.C. In my home state, they're cutting down thousands of acres of forest land. Thousands of acres of forest land. That land was sold for significantly more than it was actually worth because of the tax subsidies to put solar panels in. Now, there's no way that a fact-based, decision-making environmentalist would suggest that it's in the best interest of the environment to cut down the forest lands of this country to put up solar panels. It's just not. And so that's why we don't trust what comes out of liberal administrations. And that's just an example. It's not your fault. I mean, but I'm just, I don't understand why the Biden administration can't just leave us alone. I really don't. And with that, I yield, Mr. Chairman.
Chair, thanks, the gentleman from Georgia. Are there any other members seeking questions for this panel? If not, I want to thank you for your attendance today, and the witnesses are excused. And I would like to welcome our second panel. Sorry. While we're waiting for our second panel to be seated, I'm going to ask unanimous consent to place into the record an article from the Washington Examiner. 2/3 of swing state voters reject the Biden administration's restrictions on appliances. And ask unanimous consent that be part of the record. I want to welcome our second panel, Representative Andy Biggs and Ranking Member Jamie Raskin from the Committee of Oversight and Accountability. Representative Biggs, I welcome your testimony.
Did I get on? Yeah, it looks like it's on. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member McGovern. I'm pleased to announce, you probably didn't notice it, but I did get a haircut since the last time I was in front of your committee. So you may not be thrilled by that, but my wife was. So I urge today the passage in the Rules Committee to grant a prompt appropriate rule for the House's consideration of H.R. 7109, the Equal Representation Act. Reporting out H.R. 7109, the House Committee on Oversight and Accountability holds the decennial census should collect information about the citizenship status of our population. It is a basic data point that should be available to policymakers and the public, and adding a citizenship question on the decennial census questionnaire is the best way to obtain accurate information. Adding a citizenship question is an appropriate exercise of Congress's Article I authority over the census, and I just want to refer you briefly and discuss a little bit of the Department of Commerce versus New York case. The court in that particular case noted a host of various questions over the years that are tangential, frankly, to apportionment that have been asked on censuses. For instance, the court, and I will quote them, noted race, sex, age, health, education, occupation, housing, military service, radio ownership, age at first marriage, native tongue, close quote. Additionally, on other occasions, we've made inquiries into toilet facilities in the homes of people through the census. How many times has citizenship been actually asked on the census questionnaire? The court noted, quote, every census between 1820 and 2000, with the exception of 1840, asked at least some of the population about their citizenship or place of birth. Between 1820 and 1950, the question was asked of all households. Between 1960 and 2000, it was asked of about 1/4 to 1/6 of the population. Additionally, the court said more detailed demographic questions previously asked on the long-form questionnaire, including the question about citizenship, were instead asked on the American Community Survey, which is set each year to a rotating sample of about 2.6% of households, close quote. What that indicates is that over a 10-year period, about 1/4 of the entire population would be asked that question over the decennial census. The United Nations recommends collecting citizenship information via census. The court noted that the following other additional countries also ask citizenship questions in their respective censuses: Australia, Canada, France, Indonesia, Ireland, Germany, Mexico, Spain, and the UK. You'll note that the U.S., if it continues on without asking this question, will be the only North American state not to inquire about citizenship in its census protocols. Ultimately, the court held this, quote, in light of the early understanding of and long practice under the enumeration clause, we conclude that it permits Congress, and by extension the Secretary, meaning the Secretary of Commerce, to inquire about citizenship on the census questionnaire. Close quote. We must also restore the one person, one vote principle in apportionment by including only citizens, the voters, in the apportionment-based used to apportion representation in the House of Representatives and allocate electoral college votes. The Equal Representation Act would do just that. It would exercise Congress's authority under Section 5 of the 14th Amendment to, quote, enforce by appropriate legislation, end quote, the provisions of the 14th Amendment including Section 2 relating to apportionment by excluding non-citizens from the apportionment base. This is now even more necessary given the Biden administration's failure to, quote, take care that the laws be faithfully executed, close quote, when it comes to enforcing immigration law. Under this administration, we've not only witnessed a failure to enforce the law against millions of illegal aliens, but affirmative actions to abuse limited statutory authority to parole over 1 million inadmissible aliens into the United States. If H.R. 7109 is not passed into law, these millions of illegal aliens will be counted for purposes of apportionment, eroding the one-person, one-vote principle. And in the long line of cases that deal with census and apportionment, the term that the courts have consistently used is when you erode the one-person, one-vote, they've used the term debasing the vote of the people. We should not reward the President's failure to perform his constitutional duties, especially where that failure has transcended mere incompetence to, by all purposes, purposely engineer strategic electoral advantage for the President's party. With that, Mr. Chairman, you look forward to answering your questions, and I'll yield back.
Chair, thanks, the gentleman. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized for his statement.
Chairman Burgess, thank you very much. Always a delight to be back in the Rules Committee. We could do what the gentleman from Arizona invites us to do, but it would be completely unconstitutional. The last president tried to include a citizenship question on the decennial census in 2020 and to count only U.S. citizens in the census, as this legislation would do, and it failed for completely obvious reasons. Section 2 of the 14th Amendment states that apportionment of seats in the House is based on a count of, quote, the whole number of persons in each state, unquote, persons being the all-encompassing category larger than that of citizens or voters. When the framers wanted to impose a citizenship requirement, they sure knew how to do it. For example, when they said that the president must be a born U.S. citizen and not a naturalized citizen. Some people think that was because Thomas Jefferson was moving to block Alexander Hamilton from running for president. But in any event, it's right in the Constitution, just like it says we, as members of the House, we have to be U.S. citizens for at least 7 years, which is why if you've been naturalized in the last 3 or 4 years, you can't do it. The Supreme Court has been perfectly clear about this and made this point emphatically in a unanimous 2016 decision called Evanwell versus Abbott. And like this legislation itself, Evanwell involved a challenge to congressional apportionment based on a total count of the entire population instead of just a count of the voter population. But Justice Ginsburg held for the unanimous court that Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, quote, retained total population as the congressional apportionment base. She cited the speech made by Senator Jacob Howard upon introduction of Section 2 of the 14th Amendment. Quote, he said, the basis of representation is numbers. The committee adopted numbers as the most just and satisfactory basis, and this is the principle upon which the Constitution itself was originally framed, that the basis of representation should depend upon numbers. And such, I think, after all, is the safest and most secure principle upon which the government can rest. Numbers, not voters. Numbers, not property. This is the theory of our Constitution. Justice Ginsburg included lots of decisive legislative authority like this, including the floor statement of Representative James Blaine, who stated that, quote, no one will deny that population is the true basis of representation. For women, children, and other non-voting classes may have as vital an interest in the legislation of the country as those who actually deposit the ballot. And therefore, they all must be counted. For all of you constitutional textualists out there, the plain reading of the text is clear. Clear as day. For all of you constitutional originalists, the original purposes of the passage of the 14th Amendment have been carefully articulated and revisited repeatedly by the Supreme Court and never rebutted by any contrary legislative authority. For all of you members who like to follow precedent, every apportionment since 1790 has included every single person residing in the United States, not just those lucky enough to be given the right to vote. As the Evanwell Court noted, the 14th Amendment contemplates that representatives serve all residents, not just those eligible to vote. You don't enforce the 14th Amendment under Section 5 by violating the terms of the constitutional amendment. The meaning is indisputable, a point which settles this for anyone who wants to follow the Constitution's text and original public meaning in all cases, not just when the text favors our desired policy outcome. I remember the admonition from the former chairman of this committee, the gentleman from Oklahoma, who would tell us that we should get our work done and not waste time on legislation that will never pass the Senate, never get signed by the president, and certainly never be approved by the Supreme Court. This bill is an affront to the great radical Republicans who wrote the original Constitution and the 14th Amendment, which has always made persons, not voters, the basis for reapportionment. The census is essential to democracy, just as the framers endorsed Tom Paine's common sense. They endorsed a common census. This bill would destroy the accuracy of the census, which may have something to do with its real legislative motivation. In the 2010 census, the undercount of Hispanic U.S. citizens was 1.4%, but in 2020, that number grew to 5%. Many observers credit that 300% plus jump to the last administration's attempt to add a citizenship question to the census and all of the publicity and rumor surrounding that attempt. The addition of a question about citizenship will deter many immigrants, not only the undocumented, but persons with green cards and people who are U.S. citizens from completing the census. Many non-citizen immigrants who are seeking asylum or are refugees will avoid responding because of uncertainty over their status and fear of arbitrary law enforcement action. Extensive research over the last decade shows that many residents wrongly believe the Census Bureau shares personal responses with other agencies. They don't. Federal law prohibits the sharing of information this way, but that worry has prevented many people from answering questions about immigration status or responding to the census at all. Census data guide the allocation of $2.8 trillion each year in federal assistance to states, localities, and families for a broad range of vital services. An inaccurate census would skew the fair distribution of federal resources for the next decade and deprive many cities and towns in places like Texas and California of needed resources for everything from roads to hospitals and veterans care. I strongly oppose this legislation, Mr. Chairman, which dishonors and violates our Constitution and the values of our nation. I yield back.
Sure. Thanks, gentlemen. Gentleman yields back. Sure. Thanks, both the witnesses. Mr. Biggs, let me just ask you, is there any response you would like to make to what Mr. Raskin has just put before us?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for that opportunity. So let's consider he's made essentially three arguments. He is essentially claiming that the 14th Amendment requires that every person be counted in the census. This bill doesn't stop that. So then he basically dovetails that into apportionment. And then he uses the argument that was made with regard to women and children because in the original censuses they were non-voters and so they were covered. Well, what is interesting is when you consider that, is that those women and children have been legal Americans. They were properly and legally here. He wants to apportion based on, literally, by their own admission, 9.2 million. That's what they admit to. Illegal aliens being brought into this country during the term of the Biden administration. He wants those to be figured into the apportionment, which is an interesting position to take. He also argued, and then I'll expand on this in just a second. He also argued the suppression argument. The American Community Survey has asked a citizenship question every year, and they go out to roughly 25% of the population every 10 years. And there has never, ever been an allegation or an argument that in answering in response to the American Community Survey that there's been a suppression because there was a citizenship question asked. So let's get back to this. Evan Wall held that a state may draw its legislative districts based on total population of such legislative districts within the state. That's the argument. The court specifically declined, however, in that case, to resolve the question of whether a state may draw its districts to equalize the voter-eligible population and did not mention Congress's authority to implement Section 2 of the 14th Amendment. Didn't discuss really the nub of the bill that's before you today. It's a neat trick. It's a neat trick. Evanwell does not preclude Congress from adding a citizenship question to the census questionnaire. They could have. They could have said, hey, we're afraid that you might use this for apportionment, because that's, by the way, that's what the census is supposed to be. It's for apportionment. They could have said, no, you got to count everybody. They didn't say that. That's not what they said. And so that's a neat trick that they've made there. The case Evanwell dealt with legislative maps drawn within a state by the state after apportionment of a certain number of representatives to each state. It didn't deal with the congressional authority to implement Section 2 of the 14th Amendment by amending statutes related to apportionment. 7109 does not dictate or change in any way how states will draw their legislative maps. Internally, once the number of representatives is apportioned to them, this bill only amends existing statute to require that the apportionment calculation exclude non-citizens in the first place when apportioning representatives among the various states. Evanwell actually reiterates the importance of the one-person, one-vote principle, noting that after apportionments, states design legislative districts within the state that contain roughly equal populations, and that they presume that if you're within 10 points, that's equal representation, that's one person, one vote, but yet they've approved even as high as 17% differential at one point. Evanwell held that a state may use total population when designing those districts, but did not mandate the use of voter population. Moreover, the Evanwell case turned on whether the Equal Protection Clause in Section 1 of the 14th Amendment requires a state to consider only voters when drawing legislative districts. The court held it did not. Justice Ginsburg's dicta that total population is contemplated in apportionment is just that. It is dicta. The Equal Representation Act makes absolutely no amendments whatsoever to any laws implicating federal assistance. Non-citizens are excluded only from the apportionment based by Section 3 of the bill. The apportionment of representatives is impacted, but not the allocation of funds. By the way, I do find it a really weird argument to make that there's going to be jurisdictions that if you count non-citizens, you know how many illegal aliens you have, that somehow the federal dollars that they're getting, because it's based on illegal immigrants, is going to be reduced. This is the same group of folks that tell you illegal aliens don't get benefits from the feds. They don't get food stamps. They don't get welfare benefits. They don't get health care benefits. They don't get these cell phones. And yet somehow they're going to tell you that these jurisdictions are going to be suppressed because of that. Well, if you were to follow that to its logical end, if you were to say, what happens if you have a jurisdiction that is after apportionment, after you've counted and you've done the apportionment, 100% of them are illegally in the country? Believe it or not, there are probably places in at least one state that I could name for you where that may well be the case, if not 100%, the vast majority may well be illegally in the country. You're not going to see suppression of federal funds based on anything other than that they're here illegally. That's why you would lose those funds. Let's see here. As to the argument that undercounts will impact assistance, that's what the Democrats, they continue to make that argument. But let's respond. First, they indicate that someone is not a citizen does not reveal anything about the legality or illegality of that person's immigration status. So we're asking, are you to determine whether you're a U.S. citizen or not. We're not saying, are you here illegally? Second, the Census Bureau has strict confidentiality requirements. Finally, even if misinformed respondents were reluctant to complete the decennial census questionnaire, census workers would still enumerate those individuals. They still count those people, even if you don't know whether they're here illegally or not. The other thing is, I get back to the point that I was making earlier. This bill actually gets what most Americans have responded to literally, for, I think it's 22 out of the 25 decennial censuses. There's been 3 that didn't have this for most Americans. The rest have always had the same setup. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the question.
Well, and I thank you for that. I mean, I think the fact is that most people do think that there is a citizenship question on the census. I mean, that is just my experience, that's been the general assumption. And when this discussion came up in the 2020 census, many people were legitimately surprised that it was not. a requirement of being counted in the census. I'm going to yield to the gentlelady from Pennsylvania.
Thank you. It is deeply concerning that a bill like this is a major policy priority for the Republican Party. Restricting apportionment of citizens used to be a fringe right-wing policy proposal, but now you have the Republican presidential candidate claiming that immigrants are poisoning the blood of the country, and we're seeing these extremist positions becoming more and more mainstream in the House majority. As Ranking Member Raskin outlined, this bill is both unconstitutional and ahistorical. The Constitution's clear. Apportionment is based on the whole number of persons in each state. That language was a specific choice by Congress. Apportionment is based on total population. I mean, we struggle now to get people to fill out the census for all kinds of reasons. People are afraid that the government might disclose the information. They're afraid to fill out the form, and a question like this will only make that problem worse. Listen to Stephen Miller or Donald Trump talk for 5 minutes, and you too would be reluctant to put your immigration status on the census. Now, I mean, I do find it deeply interesting that our colleagues are trying to rationalize this bill as necessary to ensure fair and equal apportionment to the citizens of our country. I mean, you just have to look at the difference between the representation afforded to my state, Pennsylvania, the 5th most populous in the country, and that afforded to Wyoming. Wyoming has about 500,000 people. They have 2 senators and a representative. They get way more representation in Congress. And what are we supposed to do about the District of Columbia or Puerto Rico? Those are citizens, and their representation is different here. So it does come down to, are we going to follow the Constitution? Are we going to create some really different carve-outs? And I'd appreciate any thoughts you have about that, Mr. Raskin.
Well, thank you, Ms. Scanlon. Look, the constitutional question is just clear. You read the Supreme Court, any of these decisions. If you want to change the Constitution, great, go out and change the Constitution, but you got to amend it to change it. You can't just squint really hard and see what you want to see. I mean, it's very clear what the framers did originally and what happened in the 14th Amendment as well. When the Constitution started, of course, the vast majority of people couldn't vote. And there was ambiguity about who was a citizen and who was not a citizen, and a lot of it was controlled by the states at that point. So they were very careful to use the word person. That's why, of course, we evolved to saying one person, one vote, right? Women couldn't vote at the time. Children couldn't vote, and there was a lot of ambiguity about who was a citizen or not when the country started. You know, obviously, this has been the rule from the beginning. We've never reapportioned according to the citizenship population, and that would just be a dramatic and unconstitutional departure from everything that we've done before. You know, I mean, it's curious to me, I mean, even just as a policy matter, that this legislation would intend to exclude people who are green card holders, permanent residents. As I understand legislation, but I'll stand corrected if I'm wrong, they also would not be part of the apportionment. But this was not some incidental matter when the Constitution was first written. You'll remember the 3/5 clause was added to the Constitution all about the subject of how do you count the population of enslaved people for purposes of reapportionment. And of course, the northern states were saying, well, if the enslaved people are not going to be able to vote or run for office, they shouldn't be counted at all. For these purposes, the slave states were saying, yeah, they should be counted 100%, and they arrived at the infamous 3/5 compromise for purposes of counting. Interestingly, a lot of people don't understand that it was the northern states who were saying they shouldn't be counted at all. It should be 0% if they're not going to be able to vote and to participate. And it was the slave states who were saying, well, we'd love to count the enslaved people. We want them to count for the purposes of enlarging our congressional base, but they're not going to be able to participate. And after the first census and reapportionment took place in 1800, there were about a dozen additional members of our body who were added from slave states because of the fact that 60% of the enslaved population was counted for these purposes.
I think you also referenced the fact that the census is not just used for apportionment, and that has been a very real concern, this citizenship question that there was an effort by the Trump administration to foist it upon the 2020 census documents. But it actually harms states where there's a significant immigrant population and if people are afraid to be counted because of that. In terms of apportionment of federal funding, whether it's for highways or bridges, which people tend to use regardless of their citizenship status. Can you comment on that?
Well, that's right. I mean, this has been the functional rule for all of American history. We want to know where the population actually is that has to be served by government and protected by government and so on. So, look, I think our time would be better spent trying to convince our colleagues to go with the bipartisan compromise that came out of the Senate that was basically vetoed by Donald Trump, who said he didn't want a border solution, he wanted a border crisis to run against. And so, you know, what we need is effective legislative bipartisan work to make real progress on this. But, you know, this, as I said, is unconstitutional window dressing. And I just keep thinking back to my years on this committee when Chairman Cole would just say, there's no way this is going to go through the Senate. There's no way this can be signed by the president, and it can't pass in the court, so why are we wasting our time with it?
I do recall when we went through the 2020 census that some of the politicians who were most loudly talking about needing to just count citizens and exclude immigrants tended to be from states like Arizona and Texas, and then complained when the census caused them to lose population because, in fact, they had managed to scare people into not completing the census forms. So I think it is be careful what you wish for, even if it were constitutional, but it's not, so we should probably move on. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair thanks the gentlelady. The gentlelady from Minnesota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Biggs, if you have anything you wanted to respond to some of that conversation.
Yes, thank you. I don't know why I'm having so much trouble with the microphones. It's a real problem for me. First of all, if possible, I'd like to submit for the record the CBO cost estimate of this bill, which is less than $500,000 over a 5-year period, which indicates that there will be very little suppression of the federal funds. So, thank you. So I also want to talk about the Evanwell case where that my colleague seems to be so reliant on, which in some respects I think he's right in his interpretation, but in other respects there was little notation that Justice Ginsburg said at one point in there as she's talking about the pernicious 3/5 compromise that had been made, and that post-Civil War, as they wanted to make sure that people were counted, that's why they used the term whole, to move it from the 3/5 to make sure there was whole. That is merely notation. It's dicta. It doesn't mean much. But it does get to a little bit, provide some interest. But actually, language in the 14th Amendment, Section 2 itself is really instructive as well, because the language there talks specifically and makes delineation, because it talks about people who are disqualified to vote. And they will be reduced from the apportionment, it says. Now, that's interesting language to me. It's interesting language to me. And, very interesting. I also thought it was interesting when the gentlelady was referring to Wyoming as debasing Pennsylvania's one man, one vote rule, because Wyoming gets one constitutionally. Because it does. It does. But I don't think when you have one of the 50 states of the Union that they don't qualify. I mean, they wouldn't get one otherwise unless the Constitution didn't specifically prescribe it, which it does. No state shall have less than one, right? And then this argument that Arizona lost seats because I don't even know where that comes from. All I know is that Arizona continues to be one of the fastest growing states in the country, as does Texas, as most of the Sun Belt states are, which are the freer states in the Union, oddly enough. So getting back to this bill, it's not clearly unconstitutional. In fact, it is the exact opposite. It is clearly, rationally, totally constitutional, and I encourage your support for it.
Thank you, Mr. Biggs, and I will just say, I did have some other questions, but between the last two answers, you answered all of my questions. So, no, I appreciate it, because then I could, take notes. And the one thing I will say is that I do agree with Chair Burgess when he said most people think this is the case, and it seems that would be the common sense of it, is to do it that way. But with that, I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentlelady yields back, Chair. Thanks, the gentlelady. The gentlelady from New Mexico is recognized for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for presenting this. I'm sitting here listening, and as I've heard the argument, and I've read the Constitution. It's really clear. Right? So that's why this is so amazing, because you have a Constitution that's very clear. There is no doubt about what it says. It says, we shall count all persons, right?
It's perfectly clear.
Perfectly clear. And then you have a Supreme Court that has ruled, a unanimous opinion. There was some disagreements and concurrences, but a Supreme Court opinion. This matter is settled.
Well, in fact, I mean, I respect our colleagues on the other side of the aisle who filed constitutional amendments to change it. There's certainly some who say we should change this by constitutional amendment. That's the intellectually honest way to go.
Right. If we wanted to be intellectually honest, we'd have a constitutional amendment presented, and we could move from there. So, but the argument I've heard on the other side is they've talked about undocumented. They use a different term, but I don't think any person is really illegal. But they've talked about that there are the undocumented members. Is there anything in this bill that makes a difference between people who have their resident status or not resident status? I didn't see it. Is there?
And I do not see that
Yeah.
at all. And I would hope that all of us still welcome legal immigration. It's very tough to get into the country legally. I think only like 2% or 2.5% every year get in that way. And I'm for a system that makes it a lot easier to get in the country lawfully and a lot harder to get in the country unlawfully. But this would say we're not even going to count the people who've played by the rules and waited and are going to be in the process. That totally defeats the constitutional design. And, but I don't want to be ill-mannered, but it also betrays the legacy of Abraham Lincoln, who was adamant about this point, that people who were so-called declarant aliens, that is, what we would call permanent residents, aliens who've come, who've signed up and are waiting 5 years, his party, the Republican Party, supported those people's right to vote.
And we're not even asking for that. All we're suggesting is
No.
that we not take up a bill that would be unconstitutional.
That would erase them from their constitutional status, which is just being counted,
Right.
not giving them the right to vote. It doesn't give them any particular benefit. It just says they are counted because the framers were adamant that everybody in the country be part of the census and the reapportionment.
So when I go out, I just came from my district, and we had some wonderful events out there. When I go and I have a town hall, when I go and I dedicate water, wastewater infrastructure, when we look at all the manufacturing that we're bringing in because of the Biden's bipartisan infrastructure law and the great work we did last Congress, I don't go out there and say, well, I'm only going to talk to you people who are citizens. Do you do that when you go talk to your voters back home, your communities back home? It's voters, it's communities, it's workers. We're not going around asking them these questions, are we? Because we have to represent. Our job is to represent the entire community. And that community is made up of citizens. It's made up of legal residents. It's made up of a whole variety of people who are in different kinds of status here in the country, usually contributing greatly, as we now know, into the CBO. If we wouldn't have had the immigrant population, we would not be in the recovery than we are. What do you do when you go to your district? Do you ask those kinds of silly questions?
Well, I mean, I'm sure every member of this committee spends a lot of time with children who don't vote because they're not given the right to vote, but they're definitely counted for the purposes of census and reapportionment.
Right, and you know what else, when you were talking about the idea that we were counting, that when the Constitution was written, we were also not counting Native Americans.
Unless they were taxed.
Unless they were taxed, right? Yeah. So there was different things that we were not doing, but the Constitution was pretty clear. You count, and then you apportion. And there was a law that addresses that, and it doesn't deal with this. So the other thing that I find interesting is that in Texas, after California, Texas has the largest immigrant population. They would lose 6 seats. North Carolina could lose 1. Arizona could lose 1 if they wanted to go this route. But what's interesting is I've seen a map that looks at who would not be represented, like who would not have their voices heard. Because like I said, when I come here, I'm not just thinking of people who voted for me, whether they're Republican or Democrat. I'm thinking of the community that needs my help. And the Southwest would be really hard hit. Even New Mexico would be hard hit. About 35% of the people would lose, in essence, their representation. And that bothers me a lot. I think what we need to be about is increasing representation, is making sure that we respond in a much better fashion to the communities that we represent, and not going about this kind of silliness about trying to game the system to increase one party or another representation in Congress, which this smells like that's exactly what this is about.
Well, I think that's right. The framers, if you read the Northwest Ordinance, they were of the mind that territories were always like states in training. They would become states eventually. And I think that was very much their attitude about people who came to the country. They were citizens in training, citizens in waiting. There weren't all these blockades put up. Now, we might be in a different time where people want that, but we've got to amend the Constitution if you really want to start drawing constitutional lines in this way.
Right, and so many residents have chosen to become citizens, and in essence, we would be saying, well, you might be in the process of becoming citizens. Where do we draw the line? We need to be able to represent everybody who is in our district, and that's why the districts are drawn the way they are. And with that, Mr. Chair, unless you want to add anything else, with that, I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentlelady. Gentlelady yields back. The chair recognizes the vice chair of the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman has no questions. The gentleman from South Carolina is recognized.
Thank both of you for coming. Mr. Biggs, Mr. Raskin mentioned suppression. Who's being suppressed on a phone call I got from South Carolina, a resident in South Carolina, that 4 plane loads of illegals who are coming into South Carolina, going to the Medicaid office to get registered to vote. Who is being suppressed on the payment for the flights that are coming in?
So the term that has been used in the canon of cases that deal with this would say debased. So it would be those whose one man, one vote status would be debased, and that would be the citizens who are paying the way for these folks to get here, and that would be the citizens who can vote for federal officials who are having their vote diluted.
So would the same apply to, Mr. Scott, I got a call also from 4 plane flights coming into Atlanta, Georgia. Same thing. They're being suppressed, aren't they?
Yes, sir.
And I thought we had the power of the purse string, but evidently this president is running ramshot over that.
Well, that's, Mr. Norman, that gets to the point one of the points I was trying to make earlier, maybe inartfully, I don't know. But you've never seen the type of movement, it's almost a gathering, if you will, literally millions upon millions of people coming into this country illegally, and they're going to various locations throughout the country. And at the same time, we don't suppress legal immigrants. We have over 1 million every year that come in legally, and we try to facilitate that. But what happens is, when you bring in the kind of numbers of those who come into the country illegally, and this is who we know of, 9.2 million, that's what this administration has copped to. You also have millions who we don't know. We don't know where they're coming from, we don't know where they're going. And it behooves us, actually, when you conduct your census, to try to find out who's here legally, who's here as a citizen. That's really what we're trying to get at. Are you a citizen or are you not a citizen? We only think citizens should vote.
The most recent report I saw on Epoch Times said before this administration is done, there'll be close to 15 million that are in this country illegally, that we're being paid the price tag, not to mention the cost of the deaths of the Lincoln Riley, of the thousands of young people who are dead because of fentanyl. And this president, this administration is doing this for power and for votes. It's now clear this is why he's doing it. Is there any other reason you can think of?
I can think of a lot of reasons, but I don't know what this president's rationale is. All I know is that he calmly raised his hand, saying that, and early on in his presidency urged people to rush the border. Quoting.
Well, thank you for what you're doing, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, Chair. Thanks, the gentleman. Gentleman from Texas is recognized for questions.
Yeah, I just have a few questions. I'd just like to ask each of the panelists, how many people do you think are in the United States right now illegally?
So, Mr. Roy, it's impossible to say, but I can tell you that for a good 20-year period, from the early 2000s until about 2 years ago, the number that was often quoted by media types was 11 million. They now, the numbers that I hear now are consistently between 20 and 40 million illegally in the country.
How many people, and now I'll allow Mr. Raskin to answer. So the illegal, that was sort of what we sort of generally refer to as illegally present. How many, in general, how many people here who are non-citizens, legally plus illegally? Do you know?
Non-citizens is around 50 million. You got 22 million? Oh, okay. The number I just was given by staff is 22 million.
On the what, illegal number?
No, I think that's the legal foreign residents.
Do you know, Mr. Raskin?
Yeah, but I thought it was generally around 20 million who are lawful non-citizens in different categories, mostly permanent resident green card holders. And the number I've seen kicked around for undocumented is something like 10 or 12 million.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I ask is because I've seen wildly varying numbers, various studies. I mean, MIT has a study they did with Yale or somebody, I can't remember, it was a joint study. Then there was some other studies that have showed the numbers, and they vary wildly. My point of asking is bifurcating the questions that are presented by the legislation, right, into should we find out who is here and whether they are citizens or not, and how to do that. Is it surveys? Is it via the census question? And then the second question, of course, is then what to do about that vis-a-vis apportionment and the constitutional questions and legal questions that flow from that. So on the first question, what I wanted to say, because it was posited earlier, and I wanted Mr. Raskin and Mr. Biggs can answer the question for good of everybody, about whether or not the court, in responding to President Trump and I guess Commerce Secretary Ross's efforts on the question was whether that said that Congress couldn't act. I thought it was speaking directly to the executive branch's actions as opposed to just Congress. But I'd like both of you to respond to that. Ms. Raskin, you start, Mr. Biggs.
Yeah, but I read it the same way, Mr. Roy. Here's what Section 2 of the 14th says. Representatives shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers, counting the whole number of persons in each state, excluding Indians not taxed. So in defining the whole number of persons, the court has been emphatic that that means the whole number of persons in the plain meaning sense and not the whole number of voters or citizens or.
So again, that to me gets to the second part of the question. In this legislation, right, we're posing two pieces to it. One is whether we ask. Do we just simply want to know? And we put that on the question and say, okay, are you a citizen or not? And then get that information from 330 million or whatever kids, people responding. And we get all that information, we figure out, okay, are you a citizen or are you not a citizen? Are you legally here or are you not legally here? It strikes me that that is just a basic function of government, that we should do that. Now, there's questions that are raised in opposition to that about whether that would scare people, and they're not going to, all the things, all the political questions. But I just want to kind of bifurcate the questions because the argument, which is debatable, about the 14th Amendment interpretation and how it would apply, what the court would do or not, that's one question. The first question that I just kind of want to make sure I understand is, with respect to the court's opinion vis-a-vis Trump, Ross et al. In 2020 and the census, I read that to mean that was talking about their executive action on that. Congress, they left open whether Congress could do it or not, or maybe even explicitly said Congress could do it. I haven't read the opinion in a while.
Mr. Roy, they specifically said Congress can ask citizenship questions.
Couldn't remember if it was open or explicit. So my point being, if we believe, arguments notwithstanding, debate on the floor, that it is in the interest of the country to ask the question and just say, are you a citizen or not? Let's collect that information, now let's do something with it. Now maybe that doing something with it might be seem nefarious to others and some on different issues or whatever, but it seems to me a just basic, obligation on our part to say that, yeah, the federal government ought to know the people who are in this country, are you here? Are you a citizen? Are you here legally? And so forth. And then the policy prescription should flow from that. Again, I understand the argument will be that people who are here illegally, they don't want to fill out the forms, they're not going to say they're here, so then you're going to say they're undercountings, you got people who are here who aren't done, don't have papers, they don't want to answer the question. I get all those arguments. But I'm just saying, as a prudential matter as a nation, shouldn't we know who's here? And shouldn't we do that without just guessing? I think that's my question. Either one, yeah. Mr.
Well, no, but I think you've analyzed it correctly. I think you've got the arguments right. But you're just addressing the first point.
Right.
That this would be optional to do and arguably constitutional to do. And there might be equities on both sides, but appended to it is a clearly unconstitutional provision.
Well, and if I can just respond to that, I think it's far less clearly unconstitutional than my colleague asserts.
So what you're talking about, you're talking about the second piece
Yeah, we're
of
talking
the
about the
question?
apportionment, because there is no mandate in any of the canon of law that's interpreted this that is requiring.
Would the gentleman pause for 1 second? Because I want to address that question separately. But do we agree it is constitutional, lawful, Congress can do it, it's a prudential question, should we or should we not put a question on the census to determine whether or not you're a citizen or not? It's just a question of policy for us. So I want to separate those questions about whether it's constitutional or not. And then another question is, if we pass this legislation that has the two components to it, you shall ask the question, and then when you get that, you shall apportion based on citizenship, right? That's effectively what the bill says, right? That if the court were to strike down the second part, would that necessarily strike down the first part?
No, there's a severability clause.
Right. I think it's important for the body to know that. So we pass the legislation, you put that forward, you have the first component, should we know? Great, that's a good question. We can debate that policy. Second question is then should it apply for apportionment? Should that mandate on apportionment then survive constitutional scrutiny?
Yeah,
And so then I think that now begs that question on whether it would survive constitutional scrutiny. Now, gentlemen, please proceed with your thoughts, and then Mr. Raskin, yours, which you've already said about Section 14.
Mr. Raskin and I have a strong disagreement on the constitutionality. He quotes a portion of Section 2 of the 14th Amendment, but doesn't quote all of it. Because when you go to the back end of that same section, you'll see that there's a delineation and specific language that talks, with at least regard to the Electoral College, that apportionment can be lost because of disqualification of electors or voters. So that becomes an interesting dynamic to me. But I would also assert that our bill is consistent with my reading, at least certainly from dicta in Evanwall, that kind of gets to a different interpretation of whole. Even in that front section, you're not talking total. That becomes the real language. It's the total number. That's what they're asserting. And I'm asserting that this bill does not affect certainly the states.
My question that I'd ask Mr. Raskin, what's the limiting principle? Like, is there one?
To what?
To the question of whether, it's a genuine question for a friend, what would be the limiting principle on who is counted? So,
Well, the census has said they don't count people who are, tourists from France who are in town. You've got to be living in the country.
right, but is there a length of time that, and so my point is though, so this, yeah.
Well, domicile, as you know, is defined as physical presence with intention to remain. And maybe there's some grayness around the margins on that, but basically we know people who are physically present and intend to remain.
This is shady for me in terms of my recollection, but I remember certain aspects of the history of this has also to do with not just physical presence, but allegiance and questions involving that. And so whether or not you're here and have allegiance to the United States, or, that those questions are relevant. And certainly we acknowledge that Congress, like in terms of interpreting the question, I mean, Congress has had to deal with figuring out the number of representatives that we have and, make decisions all the time. I mean, it's one person, one vote, but it's 750,000 as effective as 112,000 as it was at one point in time. I just made that number up, but whatever it was at some point mathematically. But my point is just, clearly there is room for congressional and executive interpretation and application, right, of what in fact it means to be here and be a person counted, and define that, right? And and clearly in the past we've asked questions of citizenship, like what, 1830 to 1950 or something like that. So I guess my point is, I don't know that it's absolute that the assertion on the constitutional question, but my point would be, if Congress believes we should do it, we have divisions on that question. If Congress believes that we should do it, I don't see the problem in passing forward something that we believe is, especially if you can argue, if you believe it's clearly unconstitutional, then you have an obligation to vote no. Absolutely. But if you think that there's a legitimate constitutional argument, that you think that you could say that, yeah, I think you can count them under my reading of the Constitution and application of it, and we should at least get the information. Send it to the court, it gets litigated, the court gets it, wherever they come down on the question, then we would just debate whether we amend the Constitution in the absence of that. But is that, roughly how you gentlemen see it?
That's pretty much how I see it. Yeah. When Mr. Biggs said, that there's another provision in the 14th Amendment which allows for reduction of the congressional delegation, that's true. That's if there's disenfranchisement of, at that point, it was the male African-American population, then you could reduce the congressional districts by a proportionate amount. But again, that's written in the Constitution. So you know, I take your basic point, which is you want to say, if you divide these two parts of the legislation, the first one could be voted on as a matter of policy, and of course, we have just a fundamental disagreement about whether that makes any sense to do it and why we would be doing it. I think it's Section 2 that gives the explanation for why it's being done, because they do want to use what's basically an unconstitutional formula for apportioning congressional districts. One that I think, and I appreciate, I know you are a man of principle, Mr. Roy, but I think your state would probably be hurt more than almost any other state in the union by this.
I think we would potentially lose a number of seats, yes.
Yeah.
What those are, the gentlelady posited 7 seats, I think, or six seats as a possible suggestion, which is 4.5 million people, which tells me that we have a firm recognition of how many people are here who are not, who are undocumented and or documented and not citizens, that it is a very large number. Sure, yeah, of course.
So I think it's really important because we keep hearing you talk about undocumented.
I said both.
Yeah, but that number includes documented.
Right, I said both.
Yeah, and I think it's, yeah, I know, but I think it's really clear that we recognize that this impacts everybody who is here and residing regardless of status of documentation. And that's really important to acknowledge, that this is a sledgehammer approach to an issue. If you have this issue,
Well,
I think you can take it up in a way that Mr. Raskin has noted.
Reclaim my time is, yeah, I've been saying both documented and undocumented. It's questions the numbers, right? We have, again, wildly varying estimates on the undocumented population, certainly a lot more than we do the documented non-citizen population, which has a massive impact in a number of different directions on that. My only point is to say is that if we're assuming 4.5 million in Texas, roughly, which is what the number would reflect if we're talking about 6 members of Congress, roughly, then we're assuming a very, very large number. And I'm just glad to acknowledge the numbers that we're talking about. The last question on this is, I just wanted to raise the issue on the legal immigration issue, because that's posited a lot. But I just wanted to kind of clarify it. I've seen a significant number of studies that suggest that there's about roughly 51 million foreign-born individuals in the United States, which reflects 16-ish% of the population, which puts it at the highest percentage we've ever had in our history in terms of calculating it. It's higher than the early 20th century when we had the explosion of immigration in late 19th century, early 20th century. And currently, legally, to the best of the numbers that I have provided, and I know both of you are well-informed individuals. Obviously, Mr. Biggs has a lot of knowledge on the board of Arizona and committees of jurisdiction. But we've been running at roughly about 1 million people a year with some dips. I mean, in 20, because of COVID, in 21, there was a fall off in the 700,000 range, 740, back up to 22 and at 1 million. All of the teens was over 1 million a year. And I just wanted to, just for the purpose of the record, at least acknowledge whatever the percentages are in terms of applicants, our country remains a massively large door of individuals coming into the United States. If you're still talking about 1 million a year illegally on top of or separate from the population who's coming in through other channels, legally, illegally, et cetera. Would you agree with that, Mr. Biggs?
Yeah, more so than virtually all other countries combined, every year we allow legal migration. And I just want to make one, I do think it's rich with irony, when people claim that the language saying that this is unconstitutional is clear as it can be, but then refuses to use statutory language, even terms of art, on illegal aliens. I find that's rich with irony. I really do. Because, I mean, even Sting understands you have legal aliens and illegal aliens, and that's why in his song, Englishman in New York, he actually uses the term, correctly, the term of art, the statutory term. I just had to raise this, just a little
Mr. Raskin, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, well, I agree with my friend from Texas so much, but I guess I just celebrate that fact. I mean, this is
I'm
the
not
greatest
saying it's
country in
good
the
or bad.
world. Of course, everybody wants to come here. I mean, you know, Tom Paine, when he came over from the UK, he fell in love with the promise of America. He said, this land, if it lives up to its values, will be an asylum to humanity.
And I
Not an
appreciate-
insane asylum.
I
you know,
appreciate
like-
that from my friend
Yeah.
from Maryland. I would
Yeah.
I would say that we can agree on that point, but all I'm trying to do is establish for the record, for the average
Yeah.
listener, the average American, that we're going about 1 million a year on top of our current population, which is roughly 50 million foreign born, the highest percentage in history. We can say good, bad, how we teaching, how we, how do people adopt
Yeah.
and build our country? Like, how do we have unity as a country? These are all questions that we should be wrestling with as Americans. I'm just saying it's a very big number,
If you
especially
permit me
when you
one
add
more
in
observation.
parole and asylum.
I'd love to get your thoughts on this. I mean, I have in my office frequently people from the hotel industry, people from the construction industry, retail saying, we need people, we need more
Sure.
workers in the country. The hotels,
we
we're
all hear from
looking
that.
for workers, yeah.
I would argue we should also stop paying people not to work, but that's a different debate for a different day. All I really wanted to do is say here is, well, I mean, the gentleman can look down, but we have a massive welfare state. And as Milton Friedman famously said, he'd love to have wide open borders if you don't have a welfare state. So we do have $34.5 trillion of debt and all the things that flow from that, and we do have problems we've got to deal with. All I want to do here, because all we're talking about is citizenship and census, is establish that we're talking about a question to know whether you're a citizen, and establish that we are bringing into this country roughly 1 million people a year, and we have 50.x million foreign born. So hardly a closed door, hardly a, hey, you're not welcome. It's more of a question of trying to figure out how are we managing that? How are we dealing with that? And I'll make only one other point is that with respect to Texas, is we have, we're a donor state still with respect to transportation dollars, which was the example used before in terms of tax dollars versus roads received. And the 10th biggest economy in the world. I think, the idea that apportionment is all about printing money and then doling it out, I think is a mistake. I think, because that's what we're doing. It's not like we're responsibly doing something to figure out how to, we're literally just printing money and mortgaging the future to then dole it out to states based on apportionment. But with that, I'll yield back for the interest of time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair thanks. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, all I want to do here is end this hearing. The one thing I do know is that this bill isn't going anywhere. I think we've talked about it quite a bit, and I have nothing further to add. I'll yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The point that the severability clause is something that I was going to make that had not been brought up yet. And I understand, Mr. Raskin, that you don't agree with Section 3, which is the reapportionment.
Correct, yeah.
Do you have a problem with Section 2?
But you
As
mean
well?
the census question?
Yeah.
Well, my understanding is that the census question has actually been asked in on the small census, which is actually
The community survey.
a small group of people relative to the whole population, but it gets in greater depth. So it's actually already being used. So we're getting, it's sort of like taking a poll, where you take a,
So it is being asked on the community survey.
the community survey, exactly, thank you.
So are you opposed to it being asked on the census?
Well, yeah, the
Since it's
point I
already
tried
being
to-
and the community survey, for those of you who don't know, is done by the Census Bureau, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Very much so. Yeah, the only point I was making about it is that it's a recipe for confusion because, as we can see from this bill itself, the question of whether you're counted immediately gets conflated with the question of should this be used for reapportionment, should it be used for other purposes, and so it ends up having a chilling and deterrent effect on people's participation in the census, and the whole point of the census is to try to get as clear a composite picture as possible.
I disagree with that assessment, and it's already being asked on the community survey, and they're participating in the community survey, so why wouldn't they participate in the census? It's the same agencies carrying out the question.
Yeah,
But
you'd have to ask
me-
some experts of the census, but when I've asked about that question, what they've said is you know, when you're sending people to go door to door, and you're trying to get the entire population, that over the whole population, you are going to end up having a real deterrent effect on people's participation. When we want to try to get 100% photograph of who's out there.
I disagree with you on that. And there are a couple of ways the courts, I think, could rule on the other section. One is they could rule that it is, that if we pass the law, then it is going to be based on U.S. citizens. They could rule that it should be passed on people who are legally inside the United States, which would be U.S. citizens and those who actually are legally here. I do not think the court would rule that illegal immigrants should be counted in the reinforcement.
You're right, only if it changes its mind from the Evanwell decision where it said it's all persons.
Let me say this. The president this past week referred to the Japanese, one of our allies in the war against China, and India, one of our allies in our alliance against China. Two of the members of the Quad, which is important to our alliance to combat China in their aggression. He referred to those two partners as xenophobic. Do you think that our partners are xenophobic?
But, you know, I didn't see this. Literally have no idea what you're referring to. But, I mean, I take you at your word, but let me, if you don't mind, let me look into it and I can get back to you on it.
I'm concerned that the President of the United States would use that word, would throw that word around, talking about Japan and India when those two are part of the Quad in our alliance to combat China. I think it was very irresponsible for him to do it, and I think that it shows his mental capacity or lack thereof that he would make such a statement publicly. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Gentleman yields back. Chair thanks the gentleman.
Mr. Chairman, I have another submission for the record, if I may.
Yes.
Dim Rep's comment about needing more illegal aliens for redistricting goes super viral.
Without objection, so ordered. I thank our witnesses for appearing before us today. The witnesses are excused.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members.
Good job, Mr. Dixon.
And then I would like to welcome our third panel, Representative Mike Flood and Ranking Member Maxine Waters from the Committee on Financial Services.
Hello there, how are you?
For the record,